above, suspending it from the dome of the diaphragm above. Now, what could happen with this support? Of course, this is not an optimal support because after some movements, you can imagine what happened with these things. They would have been something like that. The strings would have got entangled, and that's what you don't want. The next job of your peritoneum is also to convey the abdominal organs with their supply. That's the nerve supply, the arterial supply, and the venous supply. So even again, if there was no route for these things to travel through, they would again get tangled here with each other, and that would not be optimal. So the peritoneum, besides providing support to your abdominal viscera, they also convey these arterial and venous and nerve supply to the organs. How so? This is what we'll be checking next. So how is your peritoneum exactly formed? If you want to create your own peritoneal model, I would want you to take your fist and get yourself a balloon. Yes, this is exactly what I want you to do. So now try invaginating your fist into this balloon. Now this is exactly what your visceral organs are doing with the peritoneal sac. So imagine that this balloon right here is your peritoneal sac, and that's filled with some fluid. Now this fluid is your peritoneal fluid, and the fist here is your viscera. And when you are invaginating your viscera inside this peritoneal sac, do you think that the fist is inside the balloon or inside the fluid? No, of course not. It's simply covered by the balloon. So the layer of the balloon or the peritoneal sac, which is directly in approximation with the fist, is nothing but your inner visceral layer of the peritoneal sac. And the layer which is on the opposite side, which is not in direct contact with your viscera, is the outer parietal layer. So whom or with what is the outer parietal layer in contact with? So this is quite easy for you to understand now, that the peritoneal sac, I told you, was sitting in the abdominal cavity. So this is your abdominal wall in here, and this outer layer is in contact with the abdominal wall. So of course this outer layer is in contact with the abdominal wall, and so the peritoneum on one side is lining the abdominal wall from within and also lining your viscera from above. Now there is a part of this peritoneum you can see which is overlapping with each other. If you want to understand this much better, look at this diagram. So after covering your viscera, the abdominal, the peritoneum has now folded upon itself. So this part of the peritoneum which has folded upon itself is called a ligament. It has different other terms which we'll be learning later. For now, just remember this is also called as ligament. Now, you must be like, okay, everything is fine. So we have a balloon and it has been invaginated by multiple organs. But in this diagram, can you just tell me where the balloon is and who is invaginating what and from where? Well, all these questions will be answered once we have a look at the embryology of development of the GI tract. So that's what we'll be doing next. So, as I told you, this is what you're seeing, the peritoneal sac from above. It has been cut from above and below. So this is why you're seeing the upper and the lower part is open. And this is your developing gut tube. So, the first thing you need to note in here that the gut tube invaginates the peritoneal sac from the posterior abdominal wall. So this is the rule, that it is invaginating it from the posterior side, the first thing. The second thing is that the branches from the abdominal aorta which are supplying the gut tube also start invaginating the peritoneal balloon, and while doing so you can see they create a tract for themselves. So these are the two layers in between whom they are traveling through, and see, the problem is solved. Now they won't get tangled, and this is how the peritoneum makes route for these vessels and nerves to travel through. Alright, so that's done. One more thing you need to notice in here, that while folding upon itself, the peritoneal layers create this ligament I told you before, and this ligament is supporting the gut tube from the posterior abdominal wall. Also, I have noted down some terminologies here on the right side. and I want you to understand them. Now, this ligament in here, if it's supporting the stomach in here, then that ligament will be called an omentum. If the same thing, this ligament, is supporting the large intestine or the colon from the posterior abdominal wall, you will be calling it a mesocolon. Alright? And if this gut tube here was a small intestine, then the ligament will be called a mesentery. And if this is anything besides your stomach or small or large intestine, then any other organ like liver, spleen, etc., you will be calling it a ligament. Alright? So fine, so let's move ahead. Now, so till now I've told you that the gut tube invaginates the abdominal sac from the posterior side, and so it has a single posterior attachment. But there is one exception you need to note here about the foregut. So can you see here, the foregut has a posterior attachment as well as an anterior attachment. Now why do you think so this is needed? Because you can see the rest of the gut tube, which is the midgut and the hindgut, has nothing or no other viscera growing in front of them, so there's nothing more to support. But here in front of the stomach you have this big important organ, that's the liver, growing in. And if it had only one attachment from the posterior abdominal wall, definitely this entire thing would have sat down because it needs support, and that's the entire purpose of your peritoneum. So this is why the foregut has an anterior attachment as well, so it is also somewhat supported from the anterior wall. Now once you have noted this exception, let's move forward again. So here, the stomach and the omentum. If you remember, what I told you about the omentum is the fold of peritoneum suspending the stomach, specifically the stomach. So this is the omentum. So you have two parts of the omentum. One which is dorsal to the stomach, this is a lateral view, you're seeing it, and this is the anterior abdominal wall and the posterior abdominal wall. So the one thing which is attaching it from the anterior abdominal wall is called the ventral mesogastrium, and the one thing which is attaching it with the posterior abdominal wall is called the dorsal mesogastrium. Quite easy to understand. Now what happens next? Remember, the ventral and dorsal mesogastrium are going to house some more other organs, so there will be support to them as well. So good news that the stomach has two more neighbors. Fine. So now just look at this thing here. Again, you're seeing the ventral mesogastrium is helping the liver to grow within it, and the dorsal mesogastrium is helping the spleen to grow within it. And one thing above here is the dome of the diaphragm, and the rest of the gut tube, which is the midgut and the hindgut, has only the posterior attachment, as I told you before, and they're also conveying the blood vessels through them, so they won't get tangled. Now I have added in here some arrows, the double-headed arrows. You can see the arrow which is here above, this thing is completely attached to the diaphragm. Just remember that. So it's not free, it's completely attached to the diaphragm. But down here you can see the ventral mesogastrium is incomplete because the purpose of this is met already, because it wanted to support the liver, and now the purpose is met already. It doesn't continue all the way down till the hindgut, and so now the purpose is met already. It doesn't continue all the way down till the hindgut, and so we don't have a ventral attachment down there. So of course there is no attachment with the ventral mesogastrium or of the ventral mesogastrium with anything else. So this end is free. So remember, this is the superior end which is attached with the diaphragm, the inferior end which is free. I want you to remember this because I'll be talking about this again after a few slides. Now I am standing over here and I want to look at this from above. What do you think it will be looking like? Just check it. So this is what you'll be seeing next. You're seeing it from above. So you have these organs all in one line, the stomach in the center, the spleen behind it. Now why am I calling it behind? Just look at this vertebra here. It will guide you. So this is the posterior wall. So that's why the spleen is behind it and the liver is anterior. So this part is called the falciform ligament, the anterior part of the ventral mesogastrium. Yes, because it's ahead of the stomach. So this part is this falciform ligament. This part later is going to form the lesser omentum, the part which is attaching the stomach with the liver. So a part of the ventral mesogastrium called the lesser omentum. Now behind here, these are the derivatives of the dorsal mesogastrium. The part attaching it with the spleen is called the gastrosplenic ligament, as the name suggests, and the part which is attaching the spleen with the posterior abdominal wall behind is called the splenorenal ligament, because you can see the kidney is growing in here, so it's the splenorenal ligament. Alright. Also, I want you to notice the two arrows which I've shown you here. So as I told you, because the foregut is attached on two sides, both the anterior and the posterior side, this peritoneal balloon which was entirely single, the cavity which was entirely single, has now been divided into two parts. One part which is to its right and the other part which is to its left. So for your convenience, I want you to notice it and remember, is it a right and a left sac? So this one is the right sac and this one is the left sac. Now there is no such name in embryology, or no such terminology in embryology already, but this is something I have added up to make you understand, because I want you to remember these two sacs as well for now. So the right and left cavities. Okay, now let's see what happens next. Now look at this diagram in here. The stomach tube undergoes a lot of many of rotations to finally come to the adult position in your body. So this tube doesn't stay as it is. First of all, it rotates along a longitudinal rotation axis about 90 degrees